Welcome to Spirits of Whiskey. We explore the wide world of whiskey through the many colorful personalities who make it, promote it, write it, and more.
With each podcast, Kerry Moynahan, a certified Bourbon Steward and Bartender, and yours truly, Philip Dobard, Director of the Cocktail Collection, interview whiskey's most important names.
From high-profile makers, blenders, and ambassadors,
to out-of-the-way innovators and remote pioneers.
Join us as we discover the people and elements that give the water of life its spirit.
Hi, I'm Philip Dobard, co-host of Spirits of Whiskey. We use Anchor to produce our podcast. Why? Well, in part because Anchor is the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. It's free. And Anchor has creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your computer or even your phone. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Apple, Google, Spotify, you name it. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. So download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Today we're talking with Simon Brooking, Scotch Brand Ambassador of Beam Suntory, representing Ardmore, Auchentoshan, Bowmore, Glen Glarioch, and Laphroaig. That's 5 single malts, 5 of the whiskey world's more storied brands. Now, Simon's reportedly a Master Toastmaker, so I think we could look forward to some lively conversation.
But first, it's time for Whiskey Chronicles.
Well, the world as we knew it has changed dramatically over the past few months. Events and social gatherings around the world have been postponed, and in some cases postponed twice, and many then have been canceled outright for the entire year. This is the case with the Islay Festival of Malt and Music in Scotland, which is scheduled to take place May 22nd through the 30th. This is the biggest whiskey festival of the year for the island, in which the Laphroaig distillery plays a prominent role. Our guest today is the U.S. Ambassador for Laphroaig. We'll speak more on that later, but first we look back in our chronicles to see just how the Laphroaig distillery came to be.
Two brothers, Donald and Alexander Johnston, leased 1,000 acres of land from the Laird of Islay for rearing cattle in the 1810s. That land is now known as Laphroaig. They started to grow barley in order to feed the cattle, but what does one do with a surplus of barley? They distill whiskey, of course. The word spread around Islay that the whiskey being produced at Laphroaig was quite good, and soon it became more profitable to distill whiskey than to raise cattle. So in 1850, Laphroaig whiskey was officially born. 200 years later, in 2015, I visited the distillery during the Islay Festival of Malt and Music and got to taste my very first ever whiskey wash. Today we have the pleasure of speaking with Master Ambassador for Laphroaig, Simon Brooking, who is also known as a Master Toastmaker.
Simon, welcome to the program. How are you today?
I'm very good, Philip and Kerry. Thank you very much for having me. It's been typically Scottish around here on the East Coast. So,
and you're in Brooklyn,
I
correct?
am in Brooklyn, New York, correct.
So you began in Glasgow, but now you're in Brooklyn, and presumably with many points in between. Could you tell us about your journey?
Absolutely. My dad was part of the engineering boom, which Scotland has long had history, James Watt and the steam engine, but he was part of the early aeronautic engineering boom, and so was transferred from Scotland to England to Canada to New York and brought the family with him along the way. And so I consider myself a little bit of a gypsy. Those roots have carried me over the sea and across the continent as well. I spent some time in Seattle for a few years before settling back in New York. Here in New York is where I got my first job working for Dewar's as a brand ambassador 23 years ago now.
That goes to the roots of perhaps the birth of the whole notion of the Spirits Ambassador.
Yeah, it was the very, very early years. And actually, when I went in for the interview, they were looking at trying to bring people over from Scotland, but there were visa challenges. But they discovered here I was living in New York. I had the kilt, I had the accent, I drank whiskey. I ticked off all the boxes. And
have kilt will represent.
And So the evening was going to was an evening. They set it up in a warehouse space in the garment district in Manhattan. They had set up 10 bars, horseshoe-shaped bars with 10 bartenders, and then a stage. The evening opened with a Jewish comedian, which I thought was rather interesting for a night of Scotch. And then I came on as the whiskey expert, and to gain that knowledge, they sent me back to Scotland, and I trained with the master blender for Dewar's at the time. It was really when I took my first steps in the Scotch world on the production side of it. Learned all sorts of great things. David Howie was his name.
Can we go back to Seattle for a moment? What took you to Seattle?
My graduate training with the Professional Actor Training Program. So I grew up with a theater background, and so it took me to the University of Washington, Seattle there.
Okay.
And
where did you do undergrad?
Upstate New York, Fredonia.
So you're a thespian by training?
For the first half of
by first profession.
Yeah, first half of my life I was, and it's I think it's interesting to note that with many of the brand ambassadors across the industry, that many of the most successful brand ambassadors come from a performance background. The like Andy Weir, the likes of Martin Daris, Johnny the Scott Mundell.
Johnny Mundell.
Love Johnny.
And Bernie Lubbers in the bourbon industry, is still a stand-up comic. And I think to me, it's just understanding how to, not just to present, but to be getting the message across. It's very important to we like to say, you got to play to the little old lady in the back row. You got to make sure that that you are clear, concise, and it's about storytelling. And so much of the spirits industry is about telling the story of your product, the story of our whiskey, and that's what.
Sure, because there are so many brands in the market now that differentiation is the greatest challenge, I think.
Yep, absolutely. Because for us in Scotland, we all make this whiskey basically the same way. It's, barley, water, yeast, and then it's those slight variations that make up the distinction. And the stories really help to bring the spirit to life, and the storytellers really bring the spirit to life as well. The stories are so rich and deep, and we're hoping to see the light in the current crisis that we're in right now. And yet you look at the likes of a distillery like Laphroaig and Bowmore that have been around over 200 years, and the changes and the challenges on a global scale that they have weathered through. It really is an enduring symbol for these whiskeys to serve as an example, and as giving hope to some of these other distilleries that are trying to weather through it.
Back to being an ambassador, again, we've established that you were there at the beginning of the creation of that role in the spirits industry. So you were sort of in a place to help define the role through your work. I'm sure management had an idea of what they needed, but you probably, I'm sure they were right in some respects and wrong in others. And you played a role in defining that. Can you talk about that and how it's evolved to the present day?
Absolutely. So the early years and after Dewar's, I then went over, and through working at the marketing arm for Diageo in New York, I was hired as one of the original brand ambassadors for Diageo. I was working on a local level, but there was a national team which was comprised of the likes Rick Edwards in Southern California, Stephen Beale in Northern California, Marcy Rutterhausen in Miami, Spike McClure in New York as well. So we had Midwest as well. And so we were all working on a regional level, but there was a training trip to bring us back to Scotland. And that was with a trainer that was brought along with, of course, Evan Katnack, who a dear friend and an amazing man in the business who worked at many of the top distilleries from the Diageo days, whether it be Lagavulin or working at Dalwhinnie. He worked at quite a number of those distilleries. So he was the lead for this trip over to Scotland to visit, of course, all of the Diageo distilleries, and to learn about them and to learn how to present. And so we were on a coach, on a bus, traveling through the Highlands and out to Islay. And this trainer that was on the coach with us was, her job was to make sure that we were up to our standards and our knowledge base to be able to present when we got back to the US. And this put the fear of God in all of the ambassadors. Because there were pop-up quizzes that were happening all the time, anytime, on the bus, off the bus, and it really worried the ambassadors, so much so that they spent all their time. And this was back when we didn't have phones and Google. You just had books and written notes. So they were in the books and they had their nose in the books the whole time. As we were driving through the Highlands and the Lowlands of Scotland, they were missing everything.
I was going to say, they're missing all the beautiful scenery.
Everything because they just needed to make sure that they were going to pass the test. I noticed this, and my friend Spike McClure, who is an American but has spent some time in Scotland, we were concerned. I was concerned that the experience that these new visitors to Scotland that were bringing the Scottish experience back to the United States, the experience that they were going through was they couldn't wait to get back to the US because they were just terrified of the exams that they were being put through. And that was my concern, was they were going to be taking back a negative experience of Scotland. So we got to, we were about 3/4 the way through the trip, and people were just miserable. And so we got to Cardew, which is the home of Johnny Walker, Cardew, right? And a beautiful distillery, just a jewel box of a distillery. And Ian Williamson, he welcomes us at the door. Please, welcome to the home of Johnny Walker and of Cardew. This is your home, is our home. If our home is your home, if there anything that you need, please let us know. And so Spike and I had the conversation, and we took Ian aside and said, listen, these folks here are just miserable, and that's the experience they're going to take back to the United States. So Ian spoke to Evan Katnack and said, listen, please let them enjoy the rest of here in Scotland. I mean, yes, there is a lot to be learned. There's a lot of knowledge gained, and particularly, I think, for all the book learning that you do and those that you can watch on YouTube, where you really learn is when you are there present, when you are standing in the distillery, when you are standing,
right.
Kerry, you're standing on the dock at Laphroaig. You understand, you're there.
Yep.
You absorb so much more through your pores and through your soul about,
Absolutely.
And so
absolutely.
They were given a reprieve. They were told, just please, soak it all in, throw the books away. And the other part of the early years was the regions of Scotland, to be able to put, with as many distilleries as Diageo have in their portfolio, we were able to talk about the various regions of Scotland and have a representative whiskey from each of those regions. And that was truly a golden time for for the early years.
What year was this?
So that would have been 96, 97. Was doing primarily the New York metro area, but then I expanded my territory to the East Coast, and then eventually started doing national events for Diageo. But I was looking for opportunity. I was looking for a new perspective. And that was when Jim Beam Brands at that time was looking for an ambassador for the Dalmore. And again, they were looking overseas, but issues with visas made it very somebody over from Scotland. And through my local connections in New York, somebody had mentioned to the folks at Jim Beam that, hey, there's this guy Simon who's looking for opportunity, and so they brought me in. They came to one of my presentations. They loved the work that I did and offered me the role of national ambassador for the Dalmore. Okay. So I went from a stable of Diageo's massive stable of 26 distilleries plus the blends.
Sure, it's the largest global spirits portfolio.
Yeah, to one single malt distillery, the Dow.
You went craft, as it were.
I did, and so that would have been,
what year was that in?
Around 2002. So I got to work with an amazing distillery manager at Dalmore, Drew Sinclair, who literally a month after he retired, he passed away. I think it was because his life had no meaning anymore now that he was a lifetime career whiskeyman and just a lovely man with a huge heart. And I think his heart broke when he retired. But the other gentleman that was really instrumental for me was Mr. Richard Patterson, the nose, between the likes of himself and Jim McEwen. And, I think those two really kind of top the category and being classy at the same time. Richard Patterson really, to me, just personifies class and style and panache. I think is Richard, and
he's legendary now.
Yeah, absolutely. When Beam purchased the Allied Domecq brands, that was the Maker's Mark, Sauza, Canadian Club, Courvoisier, Teachers, and Laphroaig, and with Teachers came the Ardmore brand, which up to this point had not been sold as a commercial brand. With that acquisition, they went from Jim Beam Brands to Beam Global.
Sure.
And so they sold off the Dalmore, which they had distribution rights. They didn't actually outright own the distillery. Brought on the other Ardmore and Laphroaig. And so I went from the Highland Dalmore to two peated whiskies, Ardmore being peated Highland and Laphroaig being, of course, peated Islay. So along with that, Connemara came on board.
And this was what year that Beam went from Beam to Beam Global?
I believe it was 2008. So suddenly now we've got an Irish peated, a Highland peated, and an Islay peated. So there was some interesting. That was when I was looking at the opportunity for promoting what we were calling the peated malts of distinction, because we had this peated portfolio and peaty whiskies were starting to come into their own.
Friends of Laphroaig as a concept is great fun. Can you talk about that, and also whether becoming a member is an effective means of investing in Scottish real estate?
I know a lot of folks who come to Scotland for the first time and absolutely fall in love. I mean, Kerry, I'm not sure when
that was me, totally me.
Yep. And but living on the island, on Whiskey Island, can be a little bit more challenging. In the current situation, Islay is the place to be. We invented social distancing on Islay.
But if you become a member, if you become a friend of Laphroaig, you get 1 square foot of Islay, yes?
a whole square foot. And it's a great program. It was a program that was initiated by one of the legends in the industry, Ian Henderson, during his tenure at Laphroaig. And he decided that he wanted to create this advocacy program. There really was no visitor center at the time. But if you made the trip, and hard to believe that at one time nobody went to Islay, but if you did make the trip, you made it across, he would always welcome you and give you basically the keys to the kingdom and give you everybody would get the VIP tour with Ian. But so it was his idea to create this program, that through some of the relationships with some of the marketing companies within the companies, similar to what Maker's Mark was doing with their program. But what's unique for us at Laphroaig is that square foot of land, that some days you come to visit your square foot, you might need scuba gear to actually get to it, because we are at sea level or below. And when you get a lot of rain, the field can be overwhelmed with water.
Marshlandish, you might say.
Marshlandish, yes, absolutely.
Yes. I think for our listeners, I would benefit from knowing that Islay is in the Inner Hebrides.
That is correct.
So it's very much a maritime affair.
It is the southernmost of the Hebridean islands. The one sunny day of the year, you can look south from our distillery at Laphroaig and see Ballycastle, Northern Ireland, 35 miles away. We are that close to Ireland and just far enough away. but yes, so we've done events, and Kerry, in 2015, when you were there, we had our Islay Whiskey Festival. We invited as many friends of Laphroaig to come and for a gathering, and we had 300 people showed up. Were you one of them?
No, but I almost signed up to be a friend of Laphroaig, but I was like, do I want to have a spot on the island, or do I want to have a spot on Speyside? So I didn't get one, but I was very much thinking about it, because it's both areas. The whole country of Scotland is just gorgeous.
Yeah, so it's now become a matter of pride for a lot of Laphroaig drinkers in terms of how many. Technically, you only get 1 square foot, but I know some friends of Laphroaig who have deeded the additional square foot to their dog or to their goldfish. So, and to show you the passion and the allegiance to Laphroaig, that year of the gathering, I carried gentleman's ashes over from Seattle, who was a friend of mine. And we spread ashes on his plot and raised a glass to his spirit.
Oh, that's sweet.
To me, that speaks to the passion that people will travel the world and beyond for a dram of the finest. So we don't call it Pete anymore. We call it Larry.
So the Friends of Laphroaig get, as I read it, they get 1 square foot of prime Islay real estate plus a complimentary dram at the tasting room.
There's an important part of the square foot. The land itself is that you as a friend of Laphroaig, you're protecting the land from the robber barons down the road at Lagavulin, because in the late 1800s, Lagavulin attempted a takeover. They stole one of our stillmen. They recreated a similar style of still to Laphroaig, because Laphroaig was very much in demand for blending purposes at the time. And they dammed up our Lade, our burn, our stream and redirected it over to the Lagavulin distillery. So we actually ended up having to take them to court to get our water source back. So by staking your claim as a friend of Laphroaig, you're protecting our land.
You are definitely being a friend of Laphroaig.
Yes. Indeed, the Islay Whiskey Wars.
Yes, yeah. At one time there were, in the 19th century, there were 20 distilleries on Islay, and the biggest challenge today, with more distilleries going in, is it goes back to the water. Having enough water. I'll take people up. We have a great tour which is the Water to Whiskey tour, and you hike up to the Kilbride Dam, which is our where we save our water that flows down from Loch Ben Nebrice up in the hills, and it flows down the Kilbride Dam. And I'll take people up in the middle of the summer, and it'll be a mud flat. And that was historically, traditionally, when we would shut the distilleries down, that's what we would call silent season. But every distillery has its own silent season depending on the availability of water. So that's always the biggest concern is how much water is going to be used and if you're going to be drawing from somebody else's water source.
Yeah, at least, it's not like California where we don't have any of that.
Right, exactly.
We have no water. There's never water.
We know nothing of water
right.
shortages.
Yeah, so we don't have Arizona next to Isla to be able to.
Yes, we just take it.
Yeah, no, I remember when I was there, I just was astonished at how people would just leave the water running in the bathrooms, and everyone's just like, and the restaurants would just keep refilling your water without asking, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm not used to this. I'm like, turn off the water, you're wasting water. Okay, well, I wanted to ask you, with the current state of the world and COVID-19, you've been in the industry a long time. Where do you see it going, and how do you think that it's changing currently because of the COVID-19 crisis?
Well, I think there's a lot of levels where it's affecting a lot of different layers within the industry. If we're looking at the Scotch whiskey industry, certainly we've had to shut down our distilleries temporarily in Scotland to make sure that our workers are safe. When the distilleries are up and running, you're talking 7 to 8 men and women making the whiskey, which is not a lot, but then the social distancing needs to be taken into consideration, and that's what's being revamped at the distilleries. Ways of working are being revamped as we speak. The liquid will continue to be distilled. We will be producing whiskey. As I mentioned earlier, we've got through many crises over the last 200 years. Not only the volcanic eruption in 1815, but also bad seasons of crops in the late 19th century. Actually, it became an opportunity for us because the phylloxera plague wiped out all the vineyards of France. And that for us, that's when Scotch whiskey came into popularity because Scotch and soda became the drink of fashion.
Wow.
World War II, Auchentoshan on the River Clyde, the Glasgow and the River Clyde was a major hub center for shipbuilding. And Auchentoshan, unfortunately, was in the sights of the bombers as they made their bombing raids up the River Clyde, and actually took out one of our warehouses and took out the top half of one of the residences on the property. So when you come to Auchentoshan, you'll see a ground floor building that doesn't have a roof to it, and that was as a result of the bombing blitzes, the bombing raids. But we survived it. I think,
as well as prohibition, American prohibition.
Pro a what? Prohibition again was another opportunity for us. Although Ian Hunter, our distillery manager in the early 20th century, put Laphroaig on the map globally. He was the last of the Johnston clan. He really put major improvements on the distillery. Basically, the footprint of the distillery today is a result of the work and the expansion that Ian Hunter put on Laphroaig in the early 1900s. And he discovered bourbon barrels, came to Kentucky, and as a result started bringing bourbon barrels back to Scotland and back to Laphroaig.
Right, which transformed how Scotch whiskey is aged.
Yeah, I mean, he was a little bit ahead of the curve. It wasn't until after Prohibition, when the law here in the US only allowed you to use it once. So the Scotch industry said, perfect, send them over to us. We can reuse them. We're thrifty, we Scots,
Right.
you know. It's how copper
Right.
wire was invented. Two Scotsmen fighting over a penny. It was so keep those barrels, we'll reuse them. Because of Prohibition, actually, Ian Hunter was able to get a legal prescription for Laphroaig from your doctors during Prohibition in the United States, and because the politicians would smell our whiskey and say, "Oh yeah, it must be for pouring on wounds." I say you drink it; it's going to go to your wound and anything else that might be ailing you at that time.
How long has the distilleries been shut down so far, and do you guys have a reopen date?
I can't speak specifically on the reopen date, but we're hoping the end of May. It looks like we'll be shut down for about 6 weeks time.
Cocktails. Tell us, do you have favorites? I never ask someone what their favorite cocktail is, because people are always asking me, what's your favorite cocktail? And my standard response is, as if.
Right.
Dot. As in, why would I limit myself? So talk to us a bit about cocktails. You know, you work for a massive global spirits portfolio, and a bit of a side question about how does your work fit into that massive portfolio. So anyway, if you could maybe fold all of that in and talk about cocktails and maybe other spirits.
Sure, absolutely. To your point of favorite, it's Philip, I would say, what are you drinking these days? What's your current?
Good answer.
What's your current? I made a variation on a Vieux Carré recently using Auchentoshan 3-wood. Nice. I did it in tribute to Tartan Week, which was part of Tartan Day. Tartan Day is a national day of recognition in the United States. It was a Scottish senator who decided he wanted to pay tribute. And April 6th is Tartan Day, which in New York is celebrated with Tartan Week. And we have one of the largest piping parades up 6th Avenue in the world every year. So in tribute to that, I made this cocktail, and I called it the Old Square, which is what Vieux Carré translates into, which highlights the idea of the tartan, the plaid, the tartan pattern, those overlaying of squares. And there's also the alliance between France and Scotland. So I was using ounce of Auchentoshan wood, an ounce of Courvoisier, sweet vermouth, dash of Angostura bitters, Peychaud's bitters, and a little bit of a Benedictine rinse. And love it. And
of course, I grew up in New Orleans, so this resonates. This resonates with me deeply.
Another one, it's called Blood in the Water. And it was done with Laphroaig, maraschino liqueur, grapefruit juice, and blackstrap bitters in a Collins glass, shaken, and then you top it with an Amaro de Angostura. And then he brilliantly cut out this grapefruit swath into the shape of a shark. This week you've got julep season, and that actually reminds me of we did a julep at Tales of the Cocktail one year, and it was juleps from around the world. So we had a Canadian club julep, we had an Irish julep, and our Laphroaig mint julep was a macerated pineapple. And it was a hit of the julep. Everybody was talking about it.
I could imagine.
Simon, I do have another question here for you. You've earned the title of Scotch Whiskey Ambassador of the Year at least, 10, 12 times? How many times have you had it, and how do you keep maintaining winning such an honor?
I won Global 1 year and have been commended a number of years. highly commended. I'm old now, so the older you get, I'm just.
I mean, you're no Eminence Grise, but you've been in the business a while.
So endurance, it may be, that's I've just withstood the test of time. I'm like the whiskey.
You've also been known to be a Toastmaster. How long have you kind of had that nickname, and how did that come to be?
Well, I'm raising glass quite often, and professionally, but because I've done so many of these, thousands of them over the years now, so often I get people who, I've got a toast, but I'm also going to save it and give and reference and give thanks to the toasts that they have,
Well, Simon, clearly your masterful storytelling is proof that your reputation as a toast maker is well deserved. Can you leave us with a toast in Gaelic?
Absolutely. Small and Chena, an Trínuv, a Kunig, a Chian, a Korschi, an Chalak and Tai, an Chelak an Antia Anok, an Antia Anok, Agus gach Antia, gach un Antia. And the translation means smoring the fire, keeping the fire burning. The sacred three, to save, to shield, to surround, the hearth, the house, the household. This eve, this night, this eve, this night, and every night, each single night. Amen.
All right. Simon, thank you so much for coming on the show today. We've really enjoyed our very long chat, and we plan to catch up with you in the future and see how things are going post-COVID-19.
Well, Philip and Kerry, thanks so much for having me on the Spirits of Whiskey.
World of Wheezy is up next. Stay with us.
As many of you know, Spirits of Whiskey was born of the COVID-19 pandemic, which forced us to suspend production on the pilot episode of Whiskey, A Chef's Journey. The host of that television series, award-winning chef Louise Leonard, joins us here each week for World of Wheezy, her culinary handle, to discuss food pairing and cooking with some of the whiskeys we cover on the podcast. That plus the odd bit of cocktail talk.
Hey Louise, thanks for joining us today. We talked to Simon Brooking with a whole bunch of different distillers, including Laphroaig and Auchentoshan. And he told us about two different wonderful cocktails that he's had recently with these expressions. Can you tell us what you think you would pair with them?
I sure can. I'm going to start with the Old Square. This play on the classic Vin Carré that I've actually had at the Hotel Monteleone in New Orleans was very intriguing to me. And somehow I got to thinking about pairing a bitter chocolate and chili truffle with this. I feel like the Crevassier of the orange, some bitter chocolate, a little bit of heat from a Chile de Arbol, all in a little powerful little chocolate nib would be amazing to go with this drink after a rich meal.
That sounds amazing. What do you think about the blood in the water?
So the blood in the water, I haven't had this drink, but after reading about it, I am completely intrigued. The idea of smokiness, bitterness, grapefruit juice, all happening at the same time. It's a very cool name. So I immediately thought, well, I've got to do some type of fish with this dish. I would probably do a grilled, fatty fish of sorts, like a black cod or even a good wild salmon with some caramelized fennel and tomato compote. I love the taste of fennel and grapefruit together, and I think with the grill, a little bit of grill char on some fish to go with the smokiness would be outstanding.
That sounds amazing. Well, thank you so much for joining us today and giving us some ideas for recipes with these cocktails, and we look forward to talking to you next time.
Sounds great. We'll chat soon.
Well, everyone, that does it for our first ever Spirits of Whiskey podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. If you did, tune in next time and hit subscribe.
Please visit our website to see our show notes on today's podcast at spiritsofwhiskey.com. That's whiskey with an E.
We will include a video of my first time ever tasting whiskey wash at the Laphroaig distillery, as well as Simon's cocktail recipes.
As always, you can see our upcoming topics and guest roster and links to past shows. Thanks for joining us.
Until next time,
Salanchava.
Salanchava.
Spirits of Whiskey is a production of First Reel Entertainment and the Center for Culinary Culture, home of the Cocktail Collection, and is available on Anchor, Spotify, and wherever fine podcasts can be heard.